Welcome to this webinar on International and National Copyright Policy Action for OA. On behalf of Spark Europe and IFL, I'd like to warmly welcome you to this webinar. And my name is Vanessa Proudman. I'm Director of Spark Europe. And this is Irina Kuchma, who is the OA Program Manager. And it's very much a joint effort today. So thank you so much for coming. We have 238 participants from many countries, from Canada to Brazil, Uganda, France, Netherlands. I've seen many countries. So thank you so much for giving up your time today. We also have 8 international experts with us today, representing funders, governments, and knowledge institutions, including libraries. And I'd like to thank them for coming too. So the aim of the session is to update you on international and national developments in rights retention and open licensing, and to explore how we might align on policy in this important area in the future. That's quite a challenge. But first, I'd like to say a few words on why rights retention and open licensing is so important to open research. So first of all, I'd like to take you back 20 years to the Budapest Declaration. And I quote, "By open access, we mean its free availability on the public internet, permitting any users to read, download, copy, distribute, without financial, legal, or technical barriers." So in the last 20 years, so many of us have been working on implementing this goal to increase the impact of publicly funded research. And it's actually not about green or gold or any other color. We want to have immediate open access to our research, but the author doesn't necessarily have the right to store or reuse that, which is why open licensing is also important here. So we'll be talking about that as well today. What we really need to do is to set a legal framework for the coming years that supports a new way of evaluating research outputs. So today the goal needs to be to share a wider range of academic output beyond journals, where the intrinsic value of the output is more important than the venue, and where being transparent and read is more important. And that's where OA, rights retention, and open licensing fits in. What we need now is that funders and institutions and publishers support the author in preserving the rights that they have. As policymakers, we can really empower authors to reuse their work in education and research and in the wider public dissemination of their work. We can aim to make the life of the author easier by requiring a simple legal system that supports open access to research and its reuse. Because for so many years, researchers have been confused about what they can and can't do, also when signing away their rights to publishers. And fear has also been hampering many from distributing their work as widely as they might. And although we have fair use in the US, for example, or limited exceptions in Europe, it's still too complex. We don't want researchers to have to interpret the law or to enter into discussions with their publishers when they want to reuse parts of their works, figures, etc., or if they want to have their work translated into other languages than English, or even if they want to share their work in venues that are more accessible to them if they don't have the technical infrastructures that all of us, or that many of us have. So governments, funders, institutions, and publishers can really alleviate this by setting policies that require rights retention and open licensing. And we have some of those important policymakers or movers in this direction here today. And of course, such an OA supportive copyright policy helps funders and institutions implement their OA goals. So aside from easily populating our repositories worldwide, it also helps reach our 100% OA targets, which many countries have in Europe, for example. So for those with transformative agreements, often those agreements don't cover 100% of all journals and articles. That's not always part of the deal. So this can also help get that 100%. I'd also like to end by saying that for society to continue to trust in science, public institutions have a responsibility to provide transparency to what it's invested in through open access. And 20 years into OA, we must also enable all those to publish OA. We need to do this for reasons of equity and inclusion, and that's where rights retention and open licensing policies can really facilitate these goals. So without further ado, I'd like to now pass you on to my colleague Irina from EIFL to first find out about your challenges in this area from the audience. Over to you, Irina. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vanessa. And welcome everyone. As you see, well, sorry, you can't see. we could see that we're many. We're almost 300 people, and it won't be possible for everyone to answer this question in words, or even if you would in a chat, it would be a bit hard to read. So we suggest that we'll use Menti, and I'll put a Menti link in the chat. Just a second. Yeah, and apologies, we didn't think about the hashtag for today's meeting, so unless someone could invent on the go.
We did. Agatha, I think Agatha's with us. We have a hashtag. She's going to put it in the chat.
Copyright for
Copyright
OA.
for OA, yes, there
Excellent.
we are, thanks.
So if you could go to menti.com and type a code that you see on the screen, 69649003, just to have a better idea whom we have in the room. And you can select multiple answer. And Mentimeter doesn't have an option to allow type in other responses. So maybe if you selected other, if you could write in the chat who you are. For example, EIFL is a non-governmental organization, so I would say civil society, because civil society is not on the screen, so that I would write in the chat.
So we have a huge amount of librarians with us. No surprises there.
And then repository managers, academic institutional copyright experts, researchers, research funding and research performing organization managers, policymakers. Okay. Thank you very much. Then maybe next question, and that's a real question we have to you. As Vanessa mentioned in the beginning, we'll be touching upon two questions today. One is rights retention, and another one is open licensing. And we'll have short presentations, and then we'll have a discussion. And in order to facilitate the discussion, perhaps if you could write already, if you have any issues with, first we're asking about rights retention, and then second question will be about open licensing. So thanks a lot, sir. Already have embargoes, uncertainty about publishers' responses, publisher non-compliance, complexity, lack of understanding what it means in practice, publishers insisting on copyright being transferred, legislation is too complex and vague to understand, resistance from publishers not facilitating complexity for authors, and lots of other issues. And I hope together we'll be able to address some of them in today's session. And then the second part of today's webinar is about open licensing. And if you could drop your issues with open licensing here. That would be excellent. So again, complexity. Authors are not really understanding. Many researchers don't know what it means. There is an interesting comment, author lose control. If it's open licensing by authors, I'm not sure that's the case, but perhaps you could explain what you mean by that. Confusion, understanding of different licensing by researchers, not always easy. Again, compliance. So that's really a range of issues that we are dealing with in our day-to-day activities. And I hope we'll be able to address some of them today. So please keep dropping them in a Mentimeter. And once again, to those who have joined us slightly late, if you have any questions, please use Q&A functionality, because that would be easier for us to track. And if you have any issues or comments, please use the chat. And back to you, Vanessa.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Irina. So I'd like to invite Johan Rorik, Executive Director of Coalition S, and Sally Rumsey, OA Expert for Coalition S, and invite them to put their cameras on as well. Anybody else who's not speaking right now can turn off their cameras. So I'd like to start with Coalition S talking to us about their important rights retention strategy, which a number of national and international funders have signed up to. And I'm really looking forward to hearing this. And I think it's appropriate to get them to start us off today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for inviting us. Since we only have 10 minutes, I'm going to make this quick. So the rights retention strategy, the key objectives of the rights retention strategy are, of course, to ensure that research funded by Coalition S organizations is made open access without embargo, and the CC BY license or another open license accessible through a repository. Why do we do that? We do that to make sure that all Coalition S researchers are able to publish in the journal of their choice, especially subscription journals and hybrid open access journals that are not yet part of a transformative arrangement and so do not have fully open access options. So if the publishers don't create open access options for the researchers, then we, the funders, will create open access options for them. And we also do this to encourage, of course, subscription publishers to consider developing these transformative agreements and also to adopt the transformative journal framework, committing to transition to open access. The idea is also not to limit this to Coalition S researcher. I just replied to someone on Twitter about this very fact, but also to enable all researchers to retain sufficient rights to the peer-reviewed version of their own work, because in fact, the rights retention strategy is not limited to Coalition S funded researchers. It can literally be adopted by any author claiming CC BY license to the AAM of the AAM resulting from their submission to a journal. What is the problem that we seek to resolve? Well, the minimum requirement, of course, if it's not gold 08, so the minimum requirement is that the author accepted manuscript should be deposited in a repository with zero embargo and with a CC BY license. That is now becoming an obligation to the Coalition S organization grant agreements. Since 1st of January, we have been implementing this, first to Wellcome and SFI, and then later with all the other funders. But what is the problem? We also know, of course, that many researchers sign a publishing agreement that gives away their rights to deposit the AAM in a repository with zero embargo with the CC BY license. So there results a conflict, a contradiction between the researcher's grant agreement on the one hand that they have signed and are beholden to, and the publishing agreement on the other. And this is the conflict or the contradiction that the rights retention strategy seeks to resolve, namely by applying that CC BY license. The CC BY license takes legal precedence over any later copyright transfer agreement that the author might sign. It's simply a prior, this is simply a prior agreement, a prior license on that article. And anything else the author might sign later on is null and void. So that is the solution that we seek to achieve to this contradiction. Precedence can be achieved in two ways, either by prior license or by prior obligation. Sorry for the slides. Coalition S organizations will require this immediate open access, and we in fact require more generally to retain intellectual property rights to comply with the open access obligations. So this is happening either by automatically applying a CC BY license to all future manuscripts as per the signature of the grant agreement, and this is called prior license, or by requiring that beneficiaries make sure that the CC BY license is applied to the AAM or the VOR of the manuscript. So these are slightly different approaches, but the result is the same. And I'm glad that Alea Lopez San Roman is present here. She can address some questions regarding the prior obligation later in her presentation, perhaps. At the same time, for those funders who applied prior license, there is clearly also a preference for the open access version of record whenever the funder is willing to pay. We clearly state that the AAM will only need to be made open access when there is no Plan S aligned way to make the version of record open access. So we also encourage, of course, institutional repositories to hold copy of the work, whether it's the VOR or the AAM, to assist with preservation. How do we do this? Well, we update the grant conditions, we notify the publishers of these changes, and we require beneficiaries to include details of the licensing obligations which arise from their grant agreements. So, as I said, the grant conditions that have changed now. The public copyright license is applied to all future accepted manuscripts, or in the case of the European Commission, the application of a CC BY license to the AAM or VOR is required, or an open license. And beneficiaries specify this this public copyright license, as well as the source of their funding in all submitted manuscripts. We have since July 2020, we've contacted most publishers to inform them of this approach, because with the prior license and the prior obligation strategies, it's very important that we as the funders inform the publishers that this is taking place, so that they cannot say that they didn't know about it. So we've been talking to at least 100 publishers via webinars and via the trade bodies. We of course continue a dialogue with the publishers about the rights retention strategy, and we will incorporate publisher responses, whether they are official responses or officious responses to their submission systems, in our journal checker tool. The step 3 is the important step for authors, namely we provide templated language. This templated language is something that researchers should include in their submissions. Something along these lines should be stated. CC BY license is applied to the AAM VOR arising from this submission, because again, there the researcher says, look, I am a Coalition S funded researcher. I apply this prior CC BY license to this manuscript. Publisher, you are hereby informed that I claim those rights on the AAM of this piece of work. And upon publications, of course, Coalition S funded researchers have to deposit their AAM or their VOR in a repository. We have made it easy to do that because we've developed a journal checker tool. Journal checker tool allows our researchers to combine the information about the journal name, their funder, and their institution, and the outcome tells them what they have to do. What they have to do has to depends on the specific combination outlined here, of course, whether they have to pay for a gold APC via their funder, whether the journal is under a transformative agreement and they don't have to do anything, they just need to publish, whether the journal is a transformative journal and again they need funding, or whether they have to apply the rights retention strategy. And the first iteration of that tool has been available since November 2020. Of course, it's not perfect, but we are in the process of improving it. And here I will hand over the presentation to Sally.
Yes, we've made these information aids freely available on the Coalition S website. So please do go and take a look and use them as best you can to spread the word. Thank you, Johan. As Johan has really said already, the rights retention strategy works by this idea of the CC BY license being indicated as the item is submitted to a publisher. So it's coming on works as they are created into an accepted manuscript from this submission. I hope that's fairly clear. Thank you, Johan. If there's a disagreement with the publisher, should that arise, first of all, any Coalition S author should contact their funder in the first instance, and they will work to try and investigate what's happened and make a decision and advise their libraries. It may well go via the library first of all. We should also say that Coalition S funders are, sorry, the things are chopping up on there. Coalition S funders are in a discussion with university associations in helping them adopt a similar rights retention strategy for their institutions as Coalition S is doing for its fundees. Sorry. Now then, this slide lists some of the information being peddled by publishers that we have seen. If you could click the links. There's no reason why authors can't use the rights retention strategy when submitting to any journal. If the journal doesn't like it, it can actually refuse to look at the paper. But this is basically the publisher telling the author that, that they're not allowed to use their accepted manuscript as they choose if they publish with that journal. This second statement is not correct. The author has indicated the rights on the paper. Once those rights are assigned to the paper, the journal can't then decide whether they apply it or not. This third statement, also nonsense. If authors use the magic wording, whatever the embargo restrictions the journal tries to convince the author they need to use, they do not apply. The rights retention strategy takes precedence. The author has stated the license on their own paper. And finally, this last one here, the whole point of the rights retention strategy wording is that the work can be made available as per your Coalition S funders strategy. You do not need to take any notice of the embargo restrictions the publisher tries to impose if you're the author. Now on this slide here, if you could put the next statement up as well, please, Johan. These statements here are particularly concerning. Authors may not have the funds to pay for an APC, or they may object strongly to a very high APC charge. The rights retention strategy is a way to ensure that no APC needs to be paid in a hybrid journal. Now, funders may pay the APCs, but they also permit immediate open access via repositories. The publisher sometimes tries to persuade authors that there's only one route to compliant open access, and it involves paying money to the publisher. Now, we have seen an example where the publisher is actually forcing authors to commit to paying an expensive publishing charge, knowing that the funder won't pay. Now, this means that the author has to find funds themselves or get their institution to pay. And publishers are desperately trying to persuade authors that immediate open access using the rights retention strategy will cause the downfall of scholarly publishing. Now, evidence sort of dictates otherwise, particularly in the fields of physics and economics. The Royal Society and other publishers allow immediate open access, and they're still going strong. And even the Science Journal is allowing it. And also, we should say that repositories are going very well with compliance with Plan S. Next slide, please. Now, publishers will tie authors in knots with the do's and don'ts of what they can and can't do with their accepted manuscript, who they can share it with and when, what services they're allowed to use and which not. And it makes my head spin, and I'm working with this all the time. It also seems jolly unfair that authors who should own and use their own work as they please are given some rather ridiculous instructions, such as you can put your work in an institutional website, but not in your institutional repository. It just seems crazy, that. So forget all that craziness, and authors can start being in more control of their own work if they use a very simple rights retention strategy. And that's the end, I think, Johan, isn't it?
Yes.
So one more slide. Oh, yes, our contact details.
Thank you, Sally. Okay, I'll stop sharing.
So thank you very much. I think we're going to wait with questions until Alia's done her talk. So Alia Lopez de San Roman, I'd like to invite you to give your 10-minute presentation. Alia, she's policy officer at the European Commission, and she's going to be talking about Horizon Europe. So European Commission being one of the largest of the world's funders. So thank you. Over to you, Alia.
Thank you, Vanessa. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It's really a very hot and interesting topic. I'm going to focus on open science and copyright in Horizon Europe. So as you may have seen, the draft model grant agreement of Horizon Europe was published 2 weeks ago. And here are the specific provisions with regard to copyright and licensing. So with regard to open access to peer-reviewed scientific publications, both the regulation and the model grant agreement specify that beneficiaries or authors must retain sufficient intellectual property rights to comply with the open access requirements. So sufficient IPR to comply with the open access obligations. Which are those requirements? So as the model grant agreement establishes, beneficiaries must ensure open access to peer-reviewed scientific publications, and in particular, they must ensure at the latest upon publication, the position of the author-accepted manuscript or the version of record in a trusted repository. We will provide guidance to our beneficiaries and the public on what is a trusted repository. We are working on that in the annotated grant agreement. And open access via the repository to the AAM or the version of record under CC BY or equivalent. That is very important and is a key component of our open access policy, that no matter the publication venue, open access always has to be provided via the repository. Whether it is to the AAM or the version of record is no different to us. So both are at the same level. Beneficiaries can choose to provide open access to the AAM or the version of record. We have no preference in our case for one or the other, but what is key is that this open access is provided via the repository. And we will be accepting CC BY NC, non-commercial, and CC BY ND, non-derivatives, for long text formats. Also, guidance on what we understand by long text formats will be provided in the annotated grant agreement. Then there are other requirements, such as providing information via the repository about any tool, instrument that is needed to validate the conclusions of the publication. And focusing on the licensing and copyright, we will also require that metadata is open under a public domain dedication or equivalent in line with the FAIR principles, and that the metadata provides information about the licensing terms, amongst other aspects. As some of you know, publication can happen in the venue of choosing of our beneficiaries, but only publication fees will be reimbursed for full open access venues. That was for open access to scientific publications, peer-reviewed scientific publications. With regard to research data management, because as some of you may know, in Horizon Europe, we will evolve from the focus on open access to research data to the broader concept of research data management that, of course, integrates under the accessibility part of the FAIR principles, open access to this research data when possible. So beneficiaries will have to manage the digital research data in line with the FAIR principles to establish and regularly update the DMP, and as soon as possible and within the deadline set out in the data management plan, they will have to deposit the data in a trusted repository, federated in the European Open Science Cloud if required by the conditions, and ensure open access under CC BY, public domain dedication or equivalent, following the principle as open as possible, as closed as necessary. What does this principle mean? That Although we would like to have open access to research data by default, there are exceptions. Exceptions that can be legitimate interest of the beneficiaries, for commercial purposes, privacy, security concerns. So a list that is provided in Article 35 of the Horizon Europe regulation, and that we will further elaborate on it in the annotated grant agreement. They will also have to provide information via the repository about the tools needed to reuse and validate the data. And here again, we have specific requirements with regard to metadata, which must be open under public domain dedication or equivalent to the extent legitimate interest or constraints are safeguarded, and also provide information about the licensing terms. We have, and this is very pertinent now in the current situation we are living with COVID. So we will have additional open science under the additional open science practices heading, the public emergency provision, in which, if it's imposed by the call conditions, in case of a public emergency, beneficiaries will have to immediately deposit any research output. And this is relevant because here, as you can see, we go beyond publications and research data to any research output in a repository and provide open access to it under CC BY, public domain dedication or equivalent. As an exception, if the access would be against the beneficiary's legitimate interest, beneficiaries will have to grant non-exclusive licenses under fair and reasonable conditions to the legal entities that need the research output to address the public emergency, and to commit to rapidly and broadly exploit the resulting products and services at fair and reasonable conditions. So those are the provisions with regard to open science in the Model Grant Agreement, and I try to highlight what is relevant for copyright, and also following on Johan and Sally's presentation. With regard to the Coalition S rights retention strategy, and as they mentioned, there are two main approaches, the prior license and the prior obligation. In the case of the European Commission, what we will do is what I mentioned in the previous slide. So to impose this obligation on our beneficiaries via the grant agreement, that the research articles, either the AAM or the version of record, are licensed under CC BY. So what is common to the prior license and the prior obligation is that all research articles which arise from funding from a coalitionist organization must be licensed under CC BY. And also, of course, the notice given to publishers via letters that have been sent already by coalitioners. And also we will encourage our beneficiaries to add a statement in their submissions to let publishers know about this prior obligation that is in the grant agreement. So this is with regard to Horizon Europe, our policy on open access via our funding instrument. But of course, as you know, the Commission has many different roles, and it's not only a funder, but we can also initiate legislation, we can also adopt recommendations for the member states, so we often adopt also communications. And I just wanted to put in this slide some instruments in which we have addressed copyright and IPR to retention. So, for example, in the Commission recommendation on access to and preservation of scientific information, member states, we say that member states should set and implement clear policies for open access to scientific publications resulting from publicly funded research. And as part of those policies, member states should ensure that researchers retain the necessary IPRs to comply with the open access policy requirements. Also, in that recommendations, we mentioned that member states should ensure that the institutions provide guidance and support, especially regarding the management of their IPRs. In the Digital Single Market Directive, we have Articles 3 and 4 on text and data mining, which are key for the reuse of research and information. And then in the recently adopted communication on a new era for research and innovation, we have ERA Action 9 that includes, amongst other actions, an analysis of authors' rights to enable the sharing of publicly funded peer-reviewed articles without restriction. So, just in conclusion, Copyright and IP management have always been at the core of open access. We all know that, and open science, but unfortunately, they are still often mismanaged, the term open access and open science. So from the obligations of Horizon Europe beneficiaries, that has been our focus, together with other instruments, as I mentioned before, via recommendations, via the Digital Single Market Directive. Is it the time to evolve, to put in the focus, or to complementing this approach via obligations, via rights, authors' rights? Also in line with what we were here, I think, afterwards on national experiences. And of course, it's very important to understand this as a shared responsibility, the adequate IP management of research outputs. So we are doing or trying to do our best with regard to our part as a funder, also as in our capacity to initiate the legislation, but it's a common goal that we should all take responsibility for, including researchers, institutions, and publishers through themselves. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Alia and Johan and Sally. We have 5 minutes for questions, and thanks a lot, Johan, for already answering some of them in writing. So I'll start with Emma's question. Do you currently have data of publishers accepting or denying the copyright changes suggested that the authors retain the rights for open access?
Sally, me. This is directed to us, to Sally and me. Yes.
Have you heard from publishers?
Yes. Well, we have heard from publishers. Yes. Well, let me put it this way: we have no publisher to this day has answered us directly that they will not accept any articles with the RS language. They are opposed to the rights retention strategy, but they have not indicated explicitly to us that they will refuse such papers. What they are doing, as some of the slides show, is making it difficult. I mean, they are distributing disinformation, you could say, and that is something that we've tried to address. Some of that is we have tried to address in the slides. So we don't have systematic information for now that they are systematically refusing papers carrying the rights retention strategy language. That's the diplomatic answer.
Thank you.
Sally, can you add something perhaps from your perspective?
I think that the misinformation is the most worrying thing at the moment, really, actually, that's on those slides.
Yes, because that is Trumpian, right? I mean, if you repeat it loud enough that, you know, it's all so difficult, the rights retention strategy, that it becomes difficult just by the fact of saying so. But it is not, as Sally has shown in the last slide. It's actually incredibly simple. And that is, I think, why the publishers don't want it. But okay, that's up for discussion, I suppose.
Thank you. Then there is a question from Jonathan. Some publishers are adding a clause warning that authors funded by a Coalition S funder cannot submit to that journal. How to deal with such publishers?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, well, basically, either they accept the paper or they don't. And, you know, if they don't accept it, then that publisher is not, you know, that should be called out, really. You know, it should go into the journal checker tool that publisher is not allowing this. I mean, that if they accept it, then they accept it, and the rights retention strategy stays. If they don't accept it, then you know.
The idea is this: as soon as the publisher accepts the article for review and puts it through the review process, that acceptance is implicit acceptance of the rights retention strategy, of the rights retention language, and admits implicitly that the AAM can be distributed via repository without embargo. If they don't want it, they have to say so from the start. If they say so from the start, and we see that this is systematic, because of course we will enter into a dialogue with the publisher. If this is systematic, we will record it in the journal checker tool and mark that journal as non-compliant.
And I think we should say to everybody here, if you hear of these instances, please do let us know.
We are burning to know.
Thank you. There is a question from Casper. Could you speak to any issues from choosing the very open CC BY license rather than CC BY share alike or ND, or even the not very open non-commercial no derivatives? At my university, we have researchers who are not sure that they want to publish under CC BY license. The totally open license seems to be a turnoff for quite many authors afraid of signing away control by using a very open license.
Yes, we get this question a lot, and especially from authors in the social sciences and humanities. But I do think there's a misunderstanding about the breadth and the scope of CC BY. CC BY allows you to reuse your article as you see fit and to disseminate it as you see fit, and it allows it to be reused as long as proper credit is given. So it is really the broadest license, but it also allows for the broadest scope. So there's really, nobody should really be concerned about that. I mean, as one of my colleagues once said, is if somebody is able to make money off my research article that is freely available elsewhere, it's basically the same as trying to sell bottled water from the tap. I mean, you can try it, but if you know that it's bottled water from the tap, why would you pay for it, right? Now, the question is different for books, and we are working on an open access books policy. I mean, I understand that the question is different for books, and I can see that, for instance, the EC has already implemented a policy for long formats, as they call it, so books. That includes a non-commercial, the CC BY NC non-commercial item, and that is something we might we are currently discussing to see if we should do that. There are arguments pro and contra that position. But I do think that CC BY does not pose any threat to the misuse of publication.
Thank you. And one question to Alia. The model grant agreement is in draft version. Will the open science requirements change, and should we wait for the updated version to tell our researchers what they need to do? What would you recommend?
So indeed, it's still a draft version, but personally, I don't expect the open science provisions to change much, let's say. So this is what we have already been presented some months ago as an intention, what we were intending to do. So I would encourage everyone to already work on those provisions and on how putting them into practice.
Thank you, and we'll answer the rest of questions in writing or towards the end of the webinar. So back to you, Vanessa.
Thank you very much. So thank you to the international research funders. Now we've got a session looking at some national policymakers. We've got a variety here. We've started to look at national open science policies and whether any of those policies actually include rights retention or open licensing. So we invited, so I think Ireland is rather unique there. We invited Ireland to come and talk to us about their policy, and that's Niamh up next. So Niamh Brennan, she's Programme Manager of Research Informatics at Trinity College Dublin, and Susan Riley is also with her, who's Associate University Librarian at University College Dublin. So I think I'm going to invite you to the stage, and then we'll have our next approach to national rights retention and open access deposits in repositories after that. So Niamh and Susan, over to you. If you can put your cameras on and the others turn theirs off. Thank you.
Camera on. Thank you very much, Vanessa, and thank you so much for inviting us to this really important, talk about a hot topic. So myself and Susan are going to take our brief period of time to outline the situation. I'm just going to share my slides here to show you not a solution, because that is something that I'm just going to close this down here for a moment. But we're going to talk about our national policy as it is now, and this is an unfolding situation. So to start off, we started with a quotation from our national policy in Ireland that says authors and fund and institutions are encouraged to retain copyright. So we'll have a look at that in the context of Ireland's National Open Research Forum and its Copyright Retention Challenge. So just to move on to those of you who don't know where Ireland is, just to let you know, it's a very small country, and that's significant in what we're going to say. It's a tiny country on the edge of Europe, and it's got a very tiny population. It's got less than 5 million people associated with it. So if we're talking about, you know, exerting influence, of course, you know, we obviously influence a lot in terms of research, but when it comes to copyright policy and being able to, you know, make our presence felt with big international publishers, that's a whole different story. So within Ireland, just a few facts about it. Things have all changed a lot in the last year, but it was the fastest growing economy in Europe, and more than doubled its Horizon 2020 funding. It was the European Union leader in innovation from small to medium-sized enterprises, and 11th in the global scientific ranking for quality of scientific research. So much for the statistics, and that's just to show you, for a tiny little country, it has some influence, but maybe not as much as we'd like in this particular area. So we have a long history of working on open access. It's about 15 years old, and Irena and Vanessa and others have been huge helps to us, and the European Commission through OpenAIRE and of course all of the different mandates. I'm not going to go through the whole timeline, but certainly in Ireland, from way back 2007, we were working on with EURAB and to the European Commission recommending a mandate. So on open access. Our first recommendations were on open access were in 2012, but moving forward to 2018-19, we got the national framework on the transition to an open research environment. That was came about from a group which was represented all of the institutions and the research performing organizations in Ireland, along with the funders and various other interested bodies, including government departments, and that agency or group is called NORF, the National Open Research Forum. So the National Open Research Forum created this national framework and launched it in 2019. Plan S came in just ahead of that, so the two things had to come together. And now this National Open Research Forum is going into its second phase, and Susan and I are the co-chairs of the Open Access Publications Group in the National Open Research Forum. So here's what the national framework looks like, launched by our Minister Halligan in July 2018 and endorsed by all of our agencies. A significant first step in progress towards the development of a national action plan in this area. So building on existing policies and trying to align with Plan S. Right in the middle of that, you can go and have a look at it there. It says on clause 9, authors and institutions are encouraged to retain copyright of their publications. Now you might say, that's great to have it in there, but isn't it a bit weak? It's just that they're encouraged to retain. There's no teeth in this. But remember, this is not a funder mandate. This is a national policy. That's a whole different story. So a national policy had to align with Plan S when it came in, but also remain researcher friendly to try and stay friendly to all of the researchers who might not be represented by Coalition S members. We have only one Coalition S member in Ireland, and that's Science Foundation Ireland. We have to aim for national consistency across all of our disciplines and our funding streams. So, and that includes, and here's another extract from our national policy, special consideration. We've got this commitment that we're going to benefit researchers equally and avoid unintended consequences, giving special consideration to less well understood areas, particularly arts and humanities researchers, early career researchers, researchers who are not in receipt of grant funding, right? So the funders can't mandate anything for them, and publicly funded researchers with no formal institutional affiliation. So the institutions can't mandate anything for them either. So we've committed to all of this. And here's what the law of the land says in Ireland. This is the Copyright and Related Rights Act 2000, where it says the author of the work shall be the first owner of copyright unless the work is made by an employee in the course of employment, in which case the employer is the first owner of the copyright of the work, subject to any agreement to the contrary. I'm going to hand over to Susan now, and she's going to explain why that is something that at the institutional level isn't working particularly well for Ireland now. In fact, I have to say, and I can see this reflected in a lot of the questions in the chat, while Plan S and the European Commission are to be commended in this absolutely strong approach to this, which is absolutely the right approach to take, many of our countries and our institutions are actually being left behind, or possibly bringing in a two-tier system in their country, in their institutions, where coalition-funded researchers are supported to retain copyright and the others are being left behind. So over to you, Susan, to explain further about this situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Niamh.
Next slide. So there you are.
Okay. Yeah, so Niamh has pretty much explained how we got to where we are today. We have in our National Open Research Framework, we have 14 recommendations aimed at open access. And the 9th recommendation is that authors and institutions are encouraged to retain copyright of their publications. So what we've been doing is assessing progress against these 14 recommendations, and this one in particular. And what can we say about progress? Well, we're still at the red light on the junction. We haven't really progressed this. As Niamh mentioned, only one Irish funder is a member of Plan S, and actually only one Irish funder at this moment actively supports rights retention. Previously to this, the Health Research Board and its open access policy encouraged rights retention. So encouraged and actually supporting rights retention, encouraging and supporting rights retention are maybe two different things. We've also found that institutions are not well positioned to provide support for rights retention. So Niamh pointed to the copyright law, which states that employers could potentially own the copyright of these articles produced by their researchers, their employees, but actually viewed IP policy of practically every research institution in Ireland, at least all the ones listed in WIPO. And we found that all of them in their IP policies waive their copyright over these works. So they can't at this point step in to assert copyright over their researchers' articles. And I would also say that we're not well positioned in terms of providing advice and support for funder policies like that supported by Plan. There is resources to be dedicated in advising and supporting researchers to assert their rights.
Next slide.
You're muted, Susan.
Sorry, I must have hit the button. Niamh, could you go back to the previous slide, please?
Okay.
Thank you. And I did pull out the intellectual property policy from my own institution, University College Dublin, which is very typical of an IP policy in an institution in Ireland and probably in research institutions across Europe, which states that UCD, in accordance with long-standing academic tradition, does not assert ownership of copyright in pedagogical works and scholarly publications. And this is really, I think, to support academic freedom, which is, I think, really very much at the heart of the National Open Research Forum recommendations as well, and something that we have to keep in mind when we're moving open access forward in Ireland. Next slide. So what's the path forward? Well, Ireland has taken a really important step. As Niamh said, we have a national policy. We have agreed across research institutions and funders in Ireland that we want to encourage rights retention. The next step is, I think, at EU level, support publication right in national legislation. We've seen across Europe that there is a bit of a, where there is a secondary publication right in existence, it's kind of a pick and mix. There's different embargo policies, maybe the subsequent usage rights aren't clear, and different approaches to different disciplines. So I think what we would, certainly I would like to see is a secondary publication right that is immediate and has clear usage rights in line with the Plan S policy. But I do think that that needs some EU level coordination. Secondly, what we very much need is national or sectoral level action in terms of a review of the national copyright legislation in respect of, you know, who owns the copyright of scholarly publications, and coordination of institutional policies. So can institutions intervene to support rights retention? And if they can, then we really need to make sure that their policies are aligned and there is a national level approach that respects academic freedom. And lastly, yes, we do need coordinated policies across funders. There's a variety of policies in respect to open access in Ireland, and these are important, but it is particularly important that where funders support rights retention, that there's local support for individual authors in place. So yes, if they have to choose someplace else to publish because their article has been rejected because of the rights retention statement, they need advice on where that might be, and they need guidance about how to choose a funder compliant publication venue. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we've got a number of questions and they'll come up at the end of this session. So Ariane, it's now over to the Netherlands. Ariane Skulken, he's program manager at UK BSIS. I think he's known to many of you. He also gave a presentation at the LIBE conference last year, but he's also going to share us an inspiring story about how the Netherlands has taken this on. Over to you.
Thank you, Vanessa, for inviting me. Let's put it on full screen. Yes. Yeah, the project is called You Share, We Take Care, and I'm very happy to present some lessons learned and also an actual status where we are. And we're trying to use the Dutch Copyright Act, so I think it's nice to be positioned in this presentation after the Irish presentation about what's about to implement this. If you look at the Dutch goal of reaching 100% open access, you see that if you look at the long term, that hybrid OA is fueled by the read and publish deals. Gold OA is fueled by the new publishing concepts and also funders, both from the demands and from the money. And green stays behind. And green repository OA, I will use both terms, but it stays behind. So at the same time, if you look at repository OA, of course, in your strategy, it's very important because it's cost efficient, it's sustainable. Sustainable, you are in control. If a read and publish deal is no longer in place, then you can have a fallback for green. And also, maybe not often mentioned, but two other aspects, it's retrospective OA. So not only looking at new publications, but you could also look at the past. Utrecht University used a green OA action as part of this You Share, We Take Care to ask authors if they have COVID related publications from the past that they could open up. So not only new articles. And last but not least, I think empowerment of co-authors. So often the corresponding author is, that makes the read and publish deal happen if he or she is part of a consortium. As a co-author, you have to be lucky to have a corresponding author who has a deal. And if not, then you still want or even need to have an option to go green. So There are plenty of reasons for repository OA, but there are different hurdles. One of them is the complexity already mentioned. See the Planesse examples that were told. This is from Sherpa Romeo. The page is not online anymore, but through the Internet Time Machine, you can still find it. Every publisher has his own embargo terms and his own policy. Even that policy can change, differs for every journal. It can be different for the organization you're working for the funder you use. So this is very complex for authors. And also, if you see that we're trying to steer to 100% open access and turning some knobs to more open, the publisher also turning some knobs, and they make Green OA even more complex, as a 2017 publication showed from the UK, that less and less journals have zero embargo terms, and more have longer embargo terms. So they increase the embargo terms for more than 12 months. So that is not a good trend. Of course, repository OA is very much at this moment researcher driven. The researcher has to take steps, and if you ask the researcher why he or she doesn't make use of it, it's about time, it's about the version. The author accepted manuscript is not, especially for co-authors, not always within hands. It's uploading can be complex. What am I right? Am I violating those rights or not? And also for some research areas, sharing the AAM version is not always has priority. They want the version of records. So there's some hurdles there. And then, at least theoretically, there could be the law, the Copyright Act, that can help. Now, in 2015, the Dutch government has added an amendment called Amendment de Verne, Article 25 FA, that gives authors more possibilities to share their work. The author of a short scientific work funded wholly or partly by the Dutch Public Fund is entitled to share that work publicly available for a reasonable amount of time. Well, although this is very important, it's also very vague. And for a researcher, you can't take action based on this. You can't have a discussion with your publisher based on this, because it's about interpretation. So what to do? Well, for all of you who are looking at your own national policy, I have 3 takeaways, 3 tips based on the Dutch project. And the first one is someone has to take initiative. You can all look to each other, but you have to take initiative. And in this case, the Dutch Libraries, united in UKB, decided to look at the article and to see how can we make this work. Second of all, they don't ask every lawyer from every university about interpretation, because then you get very multiple interpretations. We asked one expert, and based on that, we made a business case about the added value and a proposition. And that was very well received. Several publishers asked us, why didn't you consult us in this part of the project? And we say, well, this is our responsibility to help our authors, and interpretation of the law is not something that needs to be done between the universities and the publishers. It's not something about deal making or negotiations. We do this for our authors. So yes, we want to talk with publishers, but afterwards. The second tip is make it as powerful and simple as possible. So with every design question we had, every design debate, was always the question, is our solution helping the author? Does it make it more simple, or does it make it more complex? And then the answer appears. It has to be make it more simple. And so we are talking about the definitive published version because it's sharing of the work, not a previous version. Reasonable time. I mean, yes, of course, in the past it was about STEM versus social science and humanities. But look at COVID. Of course, publications with medical data are important, but research about the social impact, the cultural impact, the economic impact, the legal impact are as important. You can't say, well, there is a longer period of embargo needed. So one embargo term of 6 months. I think also important is short academic work is not only journal articles, but also conference papers and also chapters in edited collections. And that is applied for not only the co-author, but also not only the corresponding author, but also the co-author. So if you are part of the publication as a co-author, then you are recognized for the contribution you make, and that's why you can make use of this. You are one of the makers of the work. And tip 3, and I'm personally very proud of this, is that there was a national project team, but every institute, every university had their own project team. We worked very closely together. The rectors magnificus of every university made use of the project and the amendments, so they signed in for it. And also all universities agreed on sharing risk. So if one of the universities was challenged by, or one of the authors from a university was challenged or even sued by a publisher, then we all joined. As a result, there are plenty articles shared and no legal incidents, and a lot of valuable information was gathered. And that was plenty of evidence that this was useful for the authors. Although some authors say, well, because we are front runners, I'm not sure what my international peers will think of this. So that is something to be aware of. Publishers are critical, but we're still on speaking terms. And we want to scale up. Most important now is the workflow. How can we make the opt-in more efficient? And maybe even go to an opt-out through the terms of employment and a collective labor agreement. And also, by definition, how it is written in Article 25A, this is a right to share. This is not a right retention, and it's not plan as compliant. So that's an issue. At this moment, every university is continuing with the implementation. The first university, Leiden, has already an opt-out, so they have implemented this within the terms of employment. The medical centers are starting, so we're covering more than 90% of all Dutch publications. We're still sharing the risks. And there was a governmental evaluation of the copyright law, and there was positive feedback in that evaluation about the way we implemented 25A. But is 25A still suitable to support the current ambitions? And also the Dutch government is looking at Plan S and also says, well, maybe we want to adopt Plan S rules to all Dutch publications. So what you then see, I have 2 more slides, is this is also, what is the author? Is that a person? Can it also be the organization? Something that also in Ireland was mentioned. Yes, it is a national policy, but there is an international setting, international publishers, international co-authors. How do you do that? It's a short scientific work, so it's not for books. It's the right to share. It's not about ownership. And can 0 months be responsible, a reasonable period of time? That's all many questions. So I think for now, for the next years to come, when we look at our Article 25A, I think there are 2 big challenges. One of them, it should be more flexible. So more types of publications, more settings for what is an author. At the same time, it has to be more powerful, more explicit. So that's challenge 1. And challenge 2 is we want to go ahead for 100% OA. And I think Dutch want to be a front runner. That's great. So it has to support our national policies and ambitions. And at the same time, there's an international context. So how can we be internationally aligned? So those are the 2 big challenges. For those who want to know more, there's everything about the project is online on openaccess.nl. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ariane. Questions for Ariane, please, in the Q&A. we'll come to those shortly. And next, I'd like to welcome Chris Banks, Director of Library Services and Assistant Provost at Imperial College London. So she's really been leading a national movement on academic rights retention for a number of years, and fortunately she's persevered. She will be updating us where she is in the UK. Looking forward to hearing your talk. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and hello, everybody. As you might imagine, with a session that is as focused as this, some of what I say will very much overlap with what others have said already. So I'll try and catch us up on a bit of time. So what I'm talking about is academic rights retention, where they help to maintain choice for our academics and restrain costs for our libraries. So I'm going to talk about three different tensions. This takes us back to why are we doing all of this? But we have, first of all, the tension between business models and funder policies. So many publisher business models often work on the basis of effectively a monopolistic acquisition of rights and brands which delay or constrain reuse. And on the other hand, we're seeing funders who are increasingly seeking immediate CC BY open access to research that they fund. Our researchers are covered by multiple policies: the funder policy, the publisher policy, and the institution policy. And the smaller the overlap, the more complex for everybody involved, particularly researchers. This is a slide that some of you will have seen before, but it's really complicated from the researcher perspective. They've had their idea, they've applied for their research grant, they've hired the staff, done the research, crunched the data, written their findings up, and then in order to work out whether they are compliant with their funder or in the UK eligible for the Research Excellence Framework, they have to go through this really, really complex set of decisions. This is thank you to Arthur at Cambridge for this illustration, for this very helpful illustration of the challenges. We've got another tension that I think is growing at the moment. Under a pay-to-read model, charges are relatively widely distributed. But under a pay-to-publish model, charges begin to fall on the research-intensive institutions if we don't do anything. Now, to illustrate that, what I have here over at the left, you've got those institutions that have low volume research outputs, and on the right, you have those that have high volume outputs. Now, the focus in the UK at the moment is very much to try and achieve reasonable and affordable transformative agreements, whereby we can transfer our subscriptions into the means by which we can publish our author outputs. But the real challenge, if we don't achieve that, is that those who have low volume research outputs are more likely to be able to publish full open access of a version of record. And those with high volume research outputs, if we don't get the money balance of the funding right, are likely to need to rely on self-archiving. Then we've got another tension, which is that growth in hybrid versus the growing restrictions regarding the funding of hybrid. So that also plays into the previous slide. Growth of hybrid has been a mechanism by which publishers have facilitated open access publishing and facilitated the transfer of a lot of further money in addition to subscriptions to them. And then we have funders seeking a genuine transition to open access, and in doing so, being willing to restrict funding to support that transition. Now, we talked about two policies, the funder policy and the publisher policy, but without an institutional open access policy, we then look at which version meets funder needs in order to be eligible for funding now. And what we find is that depending on the type of deal that we are able to strike in our libraries, we have at the bottom, we have researcher concerns about choice of venue where they can publish. If certain publishers and types of deal are not eligible for funding. And for the library overall, we have concerns about the overall costs of publishing. So this is where an institutional model in open access policy and rights retention policy comes into play. Because if, as a result of exerting an institution-wide rights retention policy, we can both increase the choice of publication venues for our researchers, and Coalition S has very much done that for Coalition S funded researchers, but we also begin to have a lever that will help restrain the costs as those of our institutions seek to reach these deals. So broadly speaking, we need to work together. For funders, we need realistic implementation and transition requirements. And we're already seeing this, negotiations with other funders to increase the volume of outputs that are covered by a similar policy. And we need to incentivize and support alternative initiatives that move us away from that monopolistic acquisition of rights and of journals. We absolutely need our publishers to collaborate on realistic and affordable transition plans as we move to open access. We need publisher negotiations to inform and support academics, especially on copyright and rights retention. And we need our institutions to adopt a model open access policy or to enable preprint and overlay provision, as we are seeing with the likes of the Wellcome. And then for our researchers, they have now the opportunity to consider a license to publish rather than a direct copyright transfer license. We absolutely want to encourage them to use the rights retention strategy, and we want them, researchers, to work with our institutions on a model institutional open access policy, because that then covers more researchers than are funded necessarily by the big research funders. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. So, Irina, are you going to chair the questions again?
Yeah, and I'm actually looking at our Q&A, and looks like everyone was very clear, and we don't have any new questions. So we have some pending questions from the first part, but we could address them during the panel. So I guess we could continue with Brigitte.
So if nobody has any questions for the previous three speakers, now is your chance still to pose those questions. But if not, yes, inviting Brigitte Versiner, who's the Director of Policy at Creative Commons. So we've been talking about open licensing as well, and really looking forward to hearing Brigitte's talk. Over to you, Brigitte.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, and thank you, Irina, as well, for having me on this webinar. I'll share my screen, and like Chris mentioned just before me, I think there's going to be a bit of overlap since we're all passionate about the same topic. I think that you will hear a bit of repetition, but I'll try to give an even more high-level perspective on open access and how Creative Commons licenses can help achieve that. Just to recap, for those of you who are not familiar with Creative Commons, we are an international organization, a nonprofit based in the US, whose mission is to empower individuals and communities around the world by equipping them with technical, legal, and policy solutions to enable the sharing of knowledge and culture in the public interest. And of course, open access and open science falls squarely within that mission. So we are strong supporters of both open access and open science. Our licenses and our tools have become the global standard for OA publishing. I've heard many times CC BY, it's almost part of everyone's vocabulary, it's a given. And we wish to ensure that all the peer-reviewed publications and the data that's resulting from academic and scientific research is made available immediately, free of charge, and without restriction. So in line with our 3 strategic goals, that are coming from the new strategy that we released just back in December, a couple of months ago. Our efforts focus on 3 main areas in the context of open science. First, advocating for policy change. For example, we're involved in the drafting and preparation and advising of the UNESCO recommendation on open science. We continue to build infrastructure around our licenses and our tools. And we also offer guidance to institutions, so research institutions, education institutions, also cultural heritage institutions. But here, what is important to note is that we really focus on moving from closed to open by creating, adopting, and implementing open access policies. And recently we've given comments on the public consultation that was launched by UKRI on their new open access policy. So why open access? I don't think I need to dwell on this. Many experts have spoken before me on the fact that the traditional publishing models raise barriers that are no longer justified in the digital environment in which research is now shared and produced. We don't want this model to perpetuate unbalanced power relationships. And we think that open access is a way to disrupt that power imbalance, where the internet now allows for a much more collaborative and fair approach to science. A quick recap, what are the benefits of open science and open access for researchers? It enhances the visibility and increases the dissemination of their research. For funders, they get a better return on investment because a lot of the funds are not necessarily spent on costly publishing arrangements, but are rather directly invested in the research. And for the scientific and community and the general public, it's greater access to knowledge. And this in turn stimulates participation in knowledge creation and sharing. It encourages innovation by allowing others to build upon the content that is shared. And also, and I think quite importantly, it manages the spread of dis and misinformation by making information available to all instead of having it locked up and hidden behind paywalls. Just to give you an example, we've been focusing a lot on Europe, but a couple of days ago in Australia, the scientific research organization there moved or shifted towards open access. And I quote from the press release that the global shift towards open access aims to democratize science by ensuring research is available to everyone, not just those with journal subscriptions. And we fully adhere to this posit. In fact, we advise publishing research results under the following conditions. And again, this is fully in line with Coalition S, as far as I can tell. Zero embargo period. So everyone can read the research fully and immediately at the moment of publication. We encourage applying a CC BY license on articles to allow for activities such as text and data mining. And as concerns data, we advise CC0 according to FAIR principles, to be clear that the data is in the worldwide public domain. Just to note that for software, we do not recommend the use of Creative Commons licenses, rather an open software license is there more appropriate. We applauded Coalition's rights retention strategy, and you can read a blog about it that we wrote back in August. So we fully support that position. Just a few words on ND licenses, which stand for non-derivatives. We've heard a lot about CC BY, but what about the other Creative Commons licenses, and especially those that include this non-derivative element? We've been aware that some researchers prefer to publish their own publications under more restrictive terms than CC BY as a way to control and safeguard academic integrity. But at Creative Commons, we've issued a position that it is not the right way to address this because of the many disadvantages that ND licenses have in the open science ecosystem. So first, They prevent the adaptations for different readerships and audiences, including for any member of the public to understand scientific findings and discoveries. In other words, if the information is not made available in language or using formats and images or text that can be more easily conveyed to a broader audience, there's a loss of knowledge transmission here. It also prevents translation in other languages, so it limits the spread of the knowledge within one language sphere, and that more often the case that will be English, since this has become the lingua franca of science, so that's to the detriment of other languages. It would also prevent sharing on platforms like Wikipedia and use as open educational resources. So in a few words, open access is the best way to share science, and this has been illustrated through the COVID-19 crisis. I just want to quote something I read recently, that by January 10th of last year, just when the pandemic was taking over the world, scientists had not only isolated the responsible virus, but also sequenced its genome and published the information online. And working under much stress and uncertainty, scientists throughout the world freely shared information and relied on the findings and insights of one another. And this, to me, encapsulates the whole ethos of open science. How can anyone justify an embargo period on COVID-19 related research articles when time is of the essence in order to find a cure? Or how could one impose a no derivative condition so that the public or even patients or people involved in fighting this pandemic do not understand or do not have access to a version that they can themselves freely share with others. So scientific research must be shared as rapidly and as broadly as possible to end this pandemic. So the takeaway message on my part is that not only concerning the health crisis, but also the environmental crisis, climate change present threats that need a rapid response, and open science is paramount to solving those threats. Another quote I think is particularly inspiring is that one of the most important legacies of the coronavirus pandemic is that it reminds scientists of the nobility of their mission. It's not about fame, it's not about the money, it's about finding a cure and finding solutions to a threat that affects the entire planet. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to advertise a panel that we'll be hosting next week. It'll be dealing with exactly this issue of open data, open science, and also open source medical hardware, and how open as it played out during the pandemic can teach us lessons on how to confront new challenges that we may face in the future. If you're also interested in joining the conversation, make sure to join our network by going to creativecommons.org and be part of these conversations. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. We actually have some questions. They are in the end of the Q&A and I'll read them out to you. So the first one is, many publishers ask to be assigned an exclusive license to publish even in combination with CC BY license. This seems to defy the purpose of open licenses. What's your stance on this?
Yeah, I think we have to distinguish that there are two different levels of licensing here. One, according to the traditional model, would be that the author, the researcher, the one who wrote the publication would have to transfer the rights to the publisher, either through an assignment or grant or an exclusive license most of the time. And then the Creative Commons license comes one step further. This is the end user license. So it's the one between the right owner and everyone else, the general public. So when we talk about using Creative Commons licenses, it's not to deal with the relationship between the author and the publisher, but rather the author and the general public. Of course, following also Coalitionist stance, we think that there shouldn't be any transfer of rights from the author to the publisher, that the author should be the one retaining all rights, and therefore the license would then be entered into between the researcher / author and the public.
Thanks. And there is another question about non-derivative. If non-derivative is not the way to address the risk of misuse of open access output, what is the right way?
Right. So we believe that it's not something that should be dealt with under copyright. Often the misuse that we talk about under academic integrity deals with plagiarism. And these are usually dealt with under codes of conduct or codes of ethics that are hosted by the institution. And I also want to mention that within CC BY, which is the least restrictive license, there are some mechanisms that can help prevent such misuse. For example, if a user makes any changes to a publication that's published under CC BY, they have the obligation to show these changes and to make sure that they are not attributed to the original author. And they also have to provide a link to the original so that any reader might see that there's a difference between the document that's been modified and the original one. So I'm happy also to share a link where we explain exactly how CC BY contains those safeguards and how we think that it's a matter that should be dealt with outside of copyright because it concerns more ethical and plagiarism issues rather than copyright law.
Thanks a lot. And there is also a request to put a link to next week's panel in the chat.
Absolutely.
So I guess it's time for a panel discussion, and we have one unanswered question, and I think it's a good lead to the panel where we're going to talk about alignment and what kind of alignment is needed. And it's now a first question from Stefana. It's crucial that all EU member states act together. Legislations are different among EU member states. Does the European Commission plan to launch a survey on copyright legislations of member states with the ultimate goal of harmonizing them, or at least to prepare recommendations on copyright legislation? Perhaps Alia?
Yes, so indeed, as I mentioned, as part of the ERA communication that was published last year, we have the analysis of authors' rights for the sharing of publicly funded publications. And let's see what this analysis brings us to. So the idea of having this analysis is to explore the possible initiatives that we could take in the European Commission. We are fully aware of that need. We follow very, very closely the national initiatives that are ongoing, and debates such as and discussions such as this one are, of course, very useful for us. We have had different organizations calling for EU action. So we are working on it. We have this analysis, and let's see what the results of the analysis is to see which initiatives we can take. Also possibly legislative initiatives, so let's see.
Thanks a lot. So shall we have a panel now, Vanessa, and then go back to questions in the end?
Do you want to do another Mentimeter, or you want to do that afterwards?
Maybe I can just say that I'm opening a next question in Mentimeter, which is about what suggestions do you have on policy alignment? And if you could already start typing your answers, or those who are not panelists, and perhaps we could hear from panelists what your ideas are. And of course, you already mentioned that in your slides, but if anyone would like to kickstart the discussion now.
Do you want to, sorry, So yeah, so I'd like to welcome back everybody who was all of our speakers to talk about alignment. And we heard that you've got national policies in place, monitoring how successful they are, being aware of the funder policies that we've heard at the EC or Coalition S level, and also institutional policies, and looking at, so how do we align? We've heard from some of the speakers that there are some challenges and there are some ambitions to align. So I'm really curious to hear where you see alignment is necessary on open licensing and rights retention first off.
May I chip in there, Vanessa?
Yes, great, Sally, please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know how one would exactly do it in policy, but I think the thing that's really crystal clear is the need for communication with authors. It seems to be a really big hole in there that, you know, we've been talking about authors being confused, about not understanding, about not being aware. And I think if somehow that could be pulled into policy, although I don't have any suggestions at the moment, maybe that's something which could be done very usefully.
Well, I mean, if I can respond to that, I think there are ways. I think alignment, there should be more alignment, I think, between funder policy and institutional policies. And one way, I mean, that doesn't happen enough yet. And sometimes we are even reproached for it, like this afternoon on Twitter again. Some people said, well, why didn't you talk to the institutions first rather than to talk to the authors? I think as Coalition S, we need to do that. We are already doing that. We are now talking to university associations. And one of the asks that we are having is to simply adopt the rights retention strategy as a condition for employment. This is not something that institutions are extremely happy with. They immediately say, well, you know, in our legal framework, that is not possible. But if that is not possible, maybe we should implement a rights retention strategy through copyright law. That is another avenue that can be explored. So I think there's very many ways in which things can be aligned. They just need to be explored. And as Sally says, of course, we need to properly inform the authors of what is happening, which is part of why we're here, and why we're trying to develop all of these materials also for dissemination through libraries, institutions, and other channels.
Can I maybe
something? Vanessa, sorry, Chris, do you want to go first?
Yeah, if I may, I just want to follow up on that just from the institutional perspective, because I showed my three intersecting circles: the publisher, the funder policy, the institutional policy, and the publisher policy. We only need to get two of those aligned, namely the institutional policy and the funder policies, because by using the rights retention prior, it's a prior license. And therefore it doesn't need the publisher policy to come into alignment. Obviously, we would love the publisher policies to come into alignment. We would love not to be having to talk about policies at all, but to be actually moving to a world where the version of record is the version that is made open access, and that the publishers derive their income from other means other than by monopolistic acquisition of rights. But it is just that the two policies, the two sets, the institutional and the funder policies, can be aligned, and we've seen huge steps towards that since the publication of the original Plan S.
Thank you. Niamh has a hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'll just lower my hand now while I remember. Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's really important. But to me, what I wanted to say was that our researchers are telling us that it's not really right for the onus to be put on the researchers themselves, that they're finding it incredibly difficult. And even this morning we had a question with a researcher who had an industry partner who was insisting on copyright retention, and that the industry partner owned the copyright, and that was very difficult. It's putting them in a very difficult position, and there are very deep sensitivities in this area with collaborators and so on. So the researchers need a lot of support. When we go to the institution, our institutions are telling us that none of our institutions are strong enough to act alone, that we have to have a sectoral approach within our country. And that means that our institutions have to act together to be able to bring about some changes, possibly changes, or at least a revision of our copyright legislation. That means that we need a national effort to do this. So the other circle is the country, and there's an overarching one, which has already been referred to. I think Stefana asked that question about where is I know there's a lot of countries who aren't in the European Union here, but at least there is an opportunity there from the European Union's point of view to do this. The national approach has to be there because, as I say, a lot of institutions simply they're not willing or they're not able to actually go ahead and to make changes in this area. So we need to just be realistic about it and to try and see what other ways we can bring in to support the researchers.
Thanks. And please, Arjan.
Yes, thank you. So in Taverna, our project, we have both the opt-in and the opt-out strategy. Opt-out is only possible at this moment when an institution chooses to be part of their terms of employment, and that is in fact a very complex way to go. And the way to go even depends on every single institute, how it is organized, and other kind of rules. This, like in the Ireland case, the more you can do on the country level, the better. And I think you want to provide that researchers say to their higher senior management, well, why do we have to have such a tough set of rules? Why my colleagues in another university don't have to do that? And before you know it, the universities are discussing this between each other, and to have a strong nationwide policy in a copyright act, that would be preferable to me too. Yeah.
There is also a comment from Elizabeth Gott in a Q&A. Do you think there is a role for editors here as well? It strikes me that they have a lot of power that is rarely tapped into.
Well, I'm an editor here. I think the power of editors is greatly overestimated. When I started in this as an editor 20 years ago, I didn't even have a contract. The contract was 1 page. Basically, I had to do my best. When I stopped working for Elsevier in 2015, I had a contract that extended to 27 pages and that limited my every move. That also said that all correspondence that I wrote was the property of Elsevier. So I think, the power of editors, other than just moving on or taking their journal with them when they move on, as I did, right, is greatly exaggerated. I don't think they have that much power. I mean, of course, editors could take power in their own hands, but then they would be in contradiction probably with their publisher's agreement, for instance. What editors could do is send back every article that does not come accompanied by the rights retention strategy language. Right? That would be quite a subversive move for editors to do. But I really wonder how long such an editor would last at the publisher, at the commercial publisher. Sorry to be a bit provocative here, but I have lost my patience with many editors, as you can see.
I'm also curious about, if we think about the elements of a policy going forward, there are other national governments, legislations that might want to introduce such policies. What are the must-haves that they need to include? So I know that there are some common areas where you agree on, but not everything is agreed if we listen to some of those policies today. But which are the ones where you would say going forward we must all align on in the future?
Well, again, if I may, I would say CC BY for any researcher working at an institution receiving funds from the national government, period. I mean, it's not complicated. Don't make it more complicated than it is. If you work for a university that receives funds from a national funder, from a national body, from taxpayer. You publish all of your papers CC BY. You are paid to contribute to the commons, period. That would be my stance. But feel free to disagree.
Yeah, well, maybe it's not even about. I'm totally agree with you, but so it's not about the question if an author wants to publish it, then CC BY, but the fact that you just claim it is whatever the author does, it is by definition should be definition open, and if there is a question, then it's not the author who has to find the solution, but it is between, let's say, the publisher and the institution, or even the government.
Even the government, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, in the ideal case, that's what I would like to see. I would like to see CC BY enshrined in copyright law at the national level, ensuring, openness from the start.
Yeah.
At the root.
I think, well, maybe there are many librarians here in the audience. You said somewhere that if there was a question between the author and the publisher regarding a Plan S compliancy, that he or she has to ask the library for support. I think that's something between library and Plan S, maybe to discuss more what can the libraries do, but also what shouldn't the libraries do and do others. But that's something to further explore, I think.
Well, we kind of gently ask the libraries to do that.
Yeah.
But of course, we are at their disposal to help, right? I mean, it's not an obligation. It's just like, we are in this together. We have the same interests. Let's try and work together towards that approach.
As another librarian, I think Susan's been trying to come in. Have you?
I'm the quiet librarian. Yes, I have. Which just not actually in response to what librarians should do, but just in terms of, like, what should the national legislation look like, and what are the minimum things. I mean, I think immediate OA is important, and clear usage rights. But I do quite like that the Dutch have gone for the version of Record, because it makes the librarian's life, the repository manager's life, easier. It's a much easier workflow to manage than, trying to get AAMs from researchers. And I would say that maybe, when librarians can advise, we're not the greatest mediators between publishers. Say if a publisher or a journal rejects an article because it doesn't like the rights retention statement that Coalition S has provided, there's not a lot we can do about that apart from report it back to Coalition S and advise on alternative routes to publication. And that's not good enough, actually, from the perspective of the research. They're not happy that they're being asked to publish somewhere else. So I do think that national level action, institutions working together, that's super important.
I totally agree, Susan. I mean, right now we are in a very messy situation, of course, in this transition, right? I mean, you would like to solve this at the highest possible level, perhaps even at the European level.
I could add, although many have said this before me, but I think the standardized licensing is key. So that we encourage national governments to adopt the standard, and so far Creative Commons has established itself as the standard. But I think there's great value in having a standardization across national policies that will lead to better cooperation between countries, better cooperation between researchers and institutions. And I think that there might be a tendency to want to adapt the licenses to national specificities, but I think the benefits of standardization outweigh any perceived advantage of having something that is tailor-made, because of the cross-boundary use and because of the international nature of how science is being conducted nowadays. So I would insist on this.
And if I may come in, I believe also part of this important alignment, apart from the specificities, of course, with the licenses CC BY, is, and it has been mentioned at the very beginning by Vanessa, the research assessment and the reward system. So those copyright practices are evaluated properly and rewarded properly. And I think there really needs to be an alignment of all those that we are here and also outside from this discussion on that, on how those practices are evaluated and rewarded.
Niamh, do you have your hand up again, or was that from before? Yes. No?
You're muted, Niamh.
Thanks a million. Sorry about that. I asked Johan this earlier, and I understand that Coalition S, when they talk about the 100 researchers that they contacted, 100 plus, that those were representing 95% of the research supported by Coalition S members. But one of the things that we come across all the time, and something I'd like to see in a national policy or a supranational coalition, is some attention paid to the small independent researchers, the little ones, you know, because a lot of them are really important, especially in areas of arts, humanities and social sciences. And I think we really need to work very strongly to stop, not have a two-tier system, as I mentioned, where people who are funded in the STEM subject areas and so on can go ahead and make, and particularly funded by wealthy funders, can go ahead and make their work open access. And it's really difficult, and much more difficult for other people to do that. So I think in order to win the hearts and minds of people, it's not really about the numbers, it's about the whole you know, sort of impression that we're changing the culture and bringing everyone along. I'd like to see that inserted, that due care and attention is paid to supporting bibliodiversity, and especially publishers who really don't have any idea what any of us are talking about at the national level when we approach them to discuss this.
Yes. May I answer that and actually pick all of your brains at the same time? I mean, for small publishers, especially in social sciences and humanities, books are very important. And at least at the Coalition S level, we have not yet defined our policy for open access books. I know Alea has talked about the long formats, which are books. And so the EC has already adopted the policy of CC BY and C for books. But my question to you would be, should it be different? Should we do CC BY or should we do CC BY and C? Brigitte, I would like you to answer first, and then me.
Well, I can only give you my thoughts, which of course don't speak for the entire community, but I think that the risk with using A and C is that you may bar some educational uses. Because the NC component is interpreted not by a function of the institution that uses it. So an institution can be nonprofit, but make a commercial use. And I think the interpretation of commercial also varies greatly across jurisdictions. So there is a risk that a court might interpret that condition as restricting some activities that we think would fulfill a public interest purpose, such as education or research, if that is conducted for commercial purposes. This is why
should we then have a CC BY NC ED exception, educational exception, or do you think that goes too far?
I think, as you mentioned before, and I will quote you on this, CC BY, keep it simple.
Yeah. Okay.
And Chris?
Good.
You're muted.
Sorry, just a slightly a different view there. If you think of the way in which the business model works for journals, they get their money to publish upfront, a year, 15 months upfront, before they decide what it is that they're going to publish. Whereas for long form, all of the publisher's work has gone in, and it's often much more significant, I think, than it is with journals. All of that publisher work has gone into the object before it's actually before it starts yielding sales. So for me, I think that this is a much more complex area.
Mhm.
Although I don't at all doubt the educational strengths for not having an NC.
But which side would you come down on, Chris?
I'm going to sit on the fence.
Okay, okay. That's where I am right now. So,
Well,
Personally.
the Open Access Books Network is going to have a session on
Yeah, I know.
on copyright. So it would be great to have some of you there.
but it's
and-
interesting
and
to see what
others.
people
Of
have to
course.
say here, especially since
Super.
it's, since Alea talked about it, and I'm thinking about it, and we are discussing it within planners. So it's interesting to have some of these people on the line, since we are talking copyright,
Right.
to just take
And Neve,
advantage of the context. Neve?
you're also muted.
Again, sorry, very quickly, because I have to go like everybody else. I hope it's worth mentioning that the CC BY license isn't, or CC BY NC, that doesn't mean that people can't use the work. It just means that they can't automatically use the work. So in many cases, what we would like to see with people who have put many years into creating monographs and maybe creative arts outputs as well, that there's a message there saying that please contact the authors, that they would like to work with the others, but they want to know who's using their work because they desperately need to be able to show the impact. If there's something that we can do in that regard, then I think that will help enormously in the area. Okay.
Thank you so much. So we've actually come to the end of our 2 hours. It's really been such a rich array of experiences, thoughts. There's so much work to be done. I'm so glad we've had this conversation. We're looking forward to hosting more of these events going forward. We're going to be advocating for more rights retention and open licensing. This is at the top of Spark Europe's agenda, but also IFL's and LIBE, EBLIDE and IFLA. We will be working on this in the coming years. So watch this space. There's a lot to be done. We need to research and find out more about these good practices. We really need more alignment. I think we are in agreement on some of those high level areas where we need to align. But thank you so much for everybody for coming, and also in particular to Irina for hosting this so well. So thank you everybody for coming.
And thanks a lot to you, Vanessa, for organizing it, and to excellent speakers, and also to everyone for your questions and contributions in the chat. We'll keep this Menti open for a while, and we'll make sure that we'll capture everything you wrote. We'll also capture chat Q&As. We'll write a summary blog, and we'll be in touch with you with slides and recording links. And thanks again for joining today. It was an excellent session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, speakers. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.